This is the Fantasy Football Podcast, where we take data and convert it into fantasy success. No bias, no hot takes, only victory. This is the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast, and now your host, Dustin Chandry. Welcome into episode 10 of the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast. I'm your host, Dustin Chandry. You can find us on Twitter at FFAlchemistPod. And with a frustrating week 1 behind us, we can now turn our attention to how we can improve our teams going into week 2. There were a number of players who you drafted, some even very highly, that did not produce in week 1. And conversely, there were several players who were not drafted at all and smashed in week 1. Some are worth prioritizing for your waiver claims, while others are not, and that's really the focus of today's episode. Waiver wire targets for week 2 of the NFL season. Now, typically I'll recommend players with ownership below 50%, but there's going to be a few exceptions. And let me say this up front too. If you're in a league with an auction budget, there's a lot of depth on the waiver wire this week, and while there's one player who I'll recommend with less than 50% rostership, I think you should target really strongly. I'm talking 1/3 to maybe even close to half of your budget. A lot of these players that I'll recommend, I think you should spend less than 10% of your budget, because if you get outbid, there's still other players on the waiver wire that you can get for free once these waivers are cleared. So, with that, here's the players that I would be targeting on waivers for week 2. My highest priority ad of week 1 is going to be Falcons running back Tyler Algier. Now, Algier was kind of thought to be a high-value handcuff with little standalone value when the season started, but that was not the case in week 1. Algier finished as running back 4 on the week. He had a nearly 50% snap share with Bijan Robinson. Algier got more carries than Robinson did, and he still had 3 targets, which was a 17% target share. And when you combine Robinson and Algier's targets, the running backs got half of the team targets in week 1. Algier had 4 red zone rushing attempts compared to Robinson's 1 attempt. And of course, of those 4 attempts, Algier found the end zone twice, which propelled him into the top 5 for the week. Now, Algier should not only be rostered, again, he's in 50% availability right now, but Algier actually has standalone value. Algier is a guy that if Robinson went down, he would be an automatic start every single week going forward. But even with Robinson, he showed last week that he has standalone value. So not only should he be rostered, he should actually be in your consideration for your flex spot on a go-forward basis. Now, Algier would be my priority ad for the week. And if you're in a league where you have to budget for your waiver targets, I would target at least 1/3 of my budget going towards Tyler Algier for week 2. Now, there are a couple other running backs I would recommend if you miss out on Tyler Algier. The first is going to be Rams running back Kyren Williams, who right now has an 8% ownership in ESPN leagues. It looks like he has already supplanted Cam Akers as the running back 1. And look, Cam Akers was just awful in week 1. There's just no way around that. Akers had 22 carries, 29 yards, no targets. He had 1.3 rushing yards per carry. I checked last season across the entire league, there were 113 instances where a running back got at least 20 carries in a game. The lowest yards per carry of all 113 instances was 1.9. Akers was at 1.3. I mean, it was horrifically bad. Now back on Williams. He had a 2-to-1 snap share over Akers. He had almost 30 routes run yesterday, and he had 8 opportunities, which is carries plus targets. He had 8 opportunities in the red zone compared to only 2 for Akers. He converted those opportunities into 2 touchdowns, and he finished as a top 10 back on the week. The next running back is Eagles' Kenny Gainwell, who right now is at 35% ownership. Now, going into the game, the Eagles scratched Rashad Penny as a healthy scratch, and Gainwell dominated snaps and carries, and he got a majority of the targets over DeAndre Swift. In fact, Swift only got 1 carry and 2 targets on a 29% snap share. Gainwell finished outside the top 20 this week, but he had really strong usage on one of the best offenses in the league. He got all the red zone work. There was no red zone work for Swift, and Jalen Hurts actually didn't even have any rushing attempts. Gainwell is the running back to own in Philly. As for wide receivers, there are two wide receivers who have less than 5% ownership right now that finished inside the top 10 this week. The first we're going to talk about is Rams rookie Puka Nacua, who was tied in week 1 with the most targets in the league. He had 15 targets in week 1. He got a target on over 40% of his routes run. Last year, there were 18 instances from 13 unique wide receivers who had a game where they ran at least 30 routes and had a target rate of 40% in those games. That group is full of elite performing wide receivers, and almost all of them finished inside the top 30 of fantasy scoring last year. The other wide receiver who you should be targeting is Patriots wide receiver Kendrick Bourne, who also finished inside the top 10 this week. Now, Bourne had 11 targets, 6 receptions. 2 of those were in the red zone. He converted both into touchdown catches. And this doesn't appear to be a fluke. I mean, Bourne led the team, playing over 90% of the snaps. He got a fifth of the targets on a team that had the most passing attempts in week 1. Right? Bourne got the largest piece of the biggest pie, and he converted on 100% of his red zone targets. Bourne appears to be locked in now as the wide receiver 1 for New England in what appears to be a vastly improved offense. Now, as for tight ends, due to the depth of the position and I think kind of the week-to-week volatility, these recommendations are nothing more than your $1 sort of bids if you're in an auction league. Now, Carolina Panthers' Hayden Hurst, he finished as tight end 2 on the week. He caught 5 of 7 targets, and of course he found the end zone. Now, what's interesting is Hurts didn't actually play that many snaps. He only had slightly over 50% snap participation, but when he was in the game, he had a really high target per route rate of 26%, which is one of the best for the tight ends in week 1. So Hurst, I think, obviously profiles as a guy who, if he gets more snaps, you can consistently see some pretty solid performance. The other guy is Cowboys' Jake Ferguson. Now, this is a guy I've been high on in dynasty circles all summer, and I know his stat line reads 2 catches, 11 yards. But he had 6 targets, he led the team in targets, and he did that on only 13 routes, right? He had nearly a 50% target per route run rate, which is crazy. He was involved early in the game with the rest of the starters, and all Cowboys wide receivers and tight ends, their production was suppressed because Dallas got up big so early in this game. So the game script really worked against all pass catchers for the Cowboys. So Ferguson is still very much a guy that I think profiles as a breakout candidate. Now, there are 2 other players I'd like to mention that have limited availability, but they are available in some leagues. And if they are in your league right now, these are the guys that have to be priority claims. The first is Colts quarterback Anthony Richardson. Somehow is still showing availability in 20% of leagues. Richardson finished top 5 on the week in what was his first game of his career. He got 10 points from rushing, 40 yards and a touchdown. But what was crazy is that his passing volume and his efficiency was much higher than we expected, right? He had 37 passing attempts at a 65% completion rate. Richardson should be an automatic top 10 quarterback the rest of the season, and he is somehow still free in 20% of leagues. And the other one, also at 20% availability, is Ravens wide receiver Zay Flowers. Right? Flowers led the team in targets. He had 10 targets, and he had a commanding 36% target per route run rate. He got 2 carries, too. Now, Flowers finished inside the top 20 on the week, and he didn't even find the end zone. Baltimore will almost certainly increase their pass volume as the season progresses, and I think Flowers will benefit greatly if his target efficiency continues. And then lastly, let me mention 2 players that I think you should actually avoid when it comes to your waiver claims this week that you might be looking at. The first is going to be Ravens running back Justice Hill. Now, sadly, the Ravens lost J.K. Dobbins for the season, and Hill somehow turned 19 snaps and 8 carries into a top 20 week because he fell into 2 short yardage touchdowns. Now, the Ravens have already announced they're bringing Melvin Gordon up from the practice squad, and this backfield with Hill, Gordon, and Gus Edwards, it looks like a full-on committee the rest of the season. This is a backfield I want nothing to do with. I don't see anyone taking command, and I think Hill will just clog your bench for the rest of the year. The other is Cardinals tight end Zach Ertz, who is the only tight end who saw double-digit targets in week 1. He had 10 targets. Now, he caught 6 of them, but he only had 21 yards receiving. That's a pretty meager 3.5 yards per reception. And even with 10 targets, he finished outside the top 10 of the week at the position. The Cardinals, just flat out, they look abysmal, and other than the floor that James Conner provides, I don't want any Cardinals playing in my starting lineup going forward, and that includes Zach Ertz. So that'll do it for episode 10 of the Fantasy Alchemist podcast. Make sure you hit subscribe and follow us on Twitter at FFAlchemistPod. I'll drop another episode later this week with a full Week 1 recap with observations for all 32 teams across the National Football League. So for Dustin Chandler here at the Fantasy Alchemist podcast, thank you for listening. Thank you for listening to the Fantasy Alchemist podcast. You can follow the pod on Twitter at FFAlchemistPod or email us at fantasyalchemistpodcast@gmail.com.